I never believed in ghost stories, but something about this job felt off. When I first saw the job listing for a night shift security guard at Holloway Industrial Factory, I didn't think twice. The pay was good, the hours were weird, but I needed the money. The factory had been around for decades, producing God knows what, but during the day, it was completely deserted. That was the first red flag. The manager, Mr. Graves, was a pale, thin man with sunken eyes and an unsettling calmness. He handed me a key card and a flashlight. "Your job is simple," he said. "Stay inside, walk the perimeter every hour, and don't enter the restricted zone." His voice was low, almost like a warning. I chuckled. "Restricted zone? What's in there?" Mr. Graves didn't smile. "Just follow the rules." Then he walked away, leaving me in the dimly lit security office with a stack of old incident reports. At 11:55 p.m., the factory was silent. Just the dull hum of electricity and the occasional creak of metal beams settling. The air inside felt stale, like a place that had been abandoned for years. But that was impossible. The machines were still running. I could hear them in the distance. Rhythmic, mechanical, precise. I stepped into the main floor. The machines, massive, outdated things with rusted bolts and flickering lights, were moving on their own. Conveyor belts rolled, robotic arms twitched, and yet there were no workers, just rows of machines doing their job in complete isolation. It didn't make sense. I pulled out my phone to take a video, but as soon as I hit record, the screen glitched. Static, distortion, then black. Dead battery. But I had charged it before my shift. At 12:10 a.m., the lights flickered. A low grinding noise echoed from the far end of the factory, followed by a deep guttural hissing. It sounded like steam, but wrong, almost like something breathing. I walked toward the sound, my footsteps echoing through the vast empty space. The smell of burnt metal and something foul, like rotting meat, hung in the air. Then I saw it. A shadow moving between the machines. Not a person. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I stopped. It stopped. I turned my flashlight toward it, but the beam flickered and died. The shadow twitched. Then it ran straight at me. I don't know how I didn't hear it coming. There was no sound, no warning. 1 second I was frozen in place, staring at the dark, towering figure, and the next, it was running directly at me. The air turned thick, suffocating, as the figure sped toward me. Its long, slender limbs stretched unnaturally, jerking like something twisted and broken. My heart pounded in my chest as the lights above me flickered, and the hum of the factory grew louder, almost deafening. I spun around, adrenaline flooding my veins, and ran blindly through the maze of machines, my feet pounding on the cold concrete floor. Behind me, I could hear it, the sound of fast-moving footsteps, but they didn't sound like mine. They sounded hollow, like something far too heavy and deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder just in time to see the shadowy figure closing in on me. There was something wrong with its shape, something unnatural about the way it stretched and bent in ways a human body never could. I could barely see its face, but there was something awful about the way its eyes gleamed from beneath the dark hood it wore. Those eyes, dead black, seemed to draw me in, locking me in place for a brief, horrible moment. I turned a corner, not sure which way I was going. Every hallway looked the same, sterile, cold, lined with machines that never stopped moving. The factory floor was a labyrinth of endless corridors, and in my panic, I couldn't remember how to get back to the security office. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, and my chest tightened with fear. The air around me felt wrong, heavy, thick, as if something were pressing down on me, holding me in place. I stumbled and nearly fell, catching myself against a rusted metal pillar. My hand burned as I touched it, like the metal had been heated. But I hadn't seen a furnace or any source of heat nearby. The temperature inside the factory was strangely cold, despite the discomforting heat radiating from the walls. That's when I noticed it. There were no more sounds of machinery. The factory had become eerily silent, as though time itself had come to a standstill. No whirring gears, no churning belts, just the suffocating silence. It was as if the factory itself had stopped working, and for a split second, I thought I might have imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was tired. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the best of me. But then I saw it again. The shadow, not far behind me, moving silently as it always did, its form bending and twisting like a creature from a nightmare. I froze. It wasn't just the shape anymore. It was the smell. A stench so foul and overwhelming filled the air. It was like rotting flesh, sulfur, and burning rubber all mixed together. It burned my nose and made me gag. I pressed my sleeve to my face, trying to block the stench, but it only grew stronger, thicker. It was all around me now, almost like it was inside my lungs. The air felt poisoned, and I couldn't stop myself from coughing. Suddenly, the lights above flickered again, this time flashing on and off at a rapid pace. The factory floor seemed to twist and warp, the shadows growing longer, stretching toward me as if they were alive. The walls seemed to close in on me. I turned again, desperate to escape, but my legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in concrete. My mind raced. Where was the exit? Where was the emergency door? But my vision was blurred, and nothing looked familiar. It felt like I had been walking in circles. The factory had become an endless maze. Each hall and room lead into another, and I couldn't remember how I got in or where I was supposed to go. I glanced down at the key card Mr. Graves had given me. I pressed it against the scanner by one of the emergency exits. But the red light blinked back at me, indicating it wasn't working. What the hell? I tried again. Nothing. The exit was locked. And then I heard it. A whisper. A faint voice, muffled, like it was coming from a distance. It was soft at first, like the wind or the sound of rustling paper. But then it grew louder. Don't run. It's too late. I froze. The voice didn't sound like anyone I knew, but it was unmistakably human. It was low, distorted, almost as if it had been dragged through time, worn down by centuries of suffering. I spun around, trying to find the source, but the factory was empty, the machinery motionless. I looked up toward the ceiling, the darkness above swallowing the lights in their flickering dance. The voice sounded closer now, and I could hear the heavy breath of something approaching me. The sound wasn't coming from a person. It was like a low growl. I stepped backward, my hand trembling as I gripped the flashlight. And then I saw it. From the farthest corner of the factory, where the shadows seemed darkest, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't human. It was tall, far too tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long and angular. The figure was dressed in something dark, like a tattered cloak, and the faintest outline of a hood covered its head. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze, piercing through the darkness. It was as if its eyes were sucking the light around it, making the room grow even darker. The figure reached out toward me, its fingers stretched long, thin, and grotesque. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, frozen in place by a force I couldn't explain. The voice came again, louder now, surrounding me like a terrible echo. "You shouldn't have come here." The figure's hand reached closer, and I could feel the temperature around me drop. My breath came in shallow gasps as a cold, almost bone-chilling wind blew through the factory. I couldn't breathe. The shadowy figure was nearly upon me, its cold presence enveloping me in a suffocating grip. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. The factory wasn't empty, and whatever this thing was, it didn't want me to leave. My body felt like it was sinking into the floor. My breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the figure loomed closer. The darkness around it seemed alive, moving and twisting like smoke. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to move, but my legs wouldn't listen. It was as if some unseen force had wrapped itself around me, pinning me in place. Then, just as the figure's fingers stretched toward my face, the factory lurched. I don't know how else to describe it. It felt like the entire building had shifted, as if reality itself had glitched for a second. The overhead lights flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that made the machinery look like they were breathing. The sound of grinding metal filled the air, and suddenly, the factory wasn't empty anymore. I blinked, and in that instant, everything changed. The once abandoned workstations were now occupied. Figures stood at every machine, their backs hunched, their hands moving mechanically. Their uniforms were faded, covered in grime and something darker, something that looked wet. The air was filled with the deafening roar of machines, the relentless clanking of gears, and the rhythmic slamming of pistons. I staggered backward, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Who were these people? I stepped closer to one of the workers, reaching out with a trembling hand. "Hey!" My voice barely carried over the noise. No response. The worker's head jerked to the side, but he didn't look at me. Instead, his entire body twitched, spasming unnaturally, as if controlled by invisible strings. His hands never stopped moving, methodically placing pieces onto the assembly line, over and over again. I took another step closer, my stomach twisting. His skin was gray, waxy, stretched too tight over his bones. The side of his face that I could see was hollow, his cheeks sunken in like he hadn't eaten in years. Then, slowly, his head turned all the way around, his neck making a horrible cracking sound as he finally looked at me. His eyes were empty sockets, dark holes where his pupils should have been. And yet, I could feel him staring at me. He opened his mouth, lips cracking apart, and a voice, like a grinding machine, whispered directly into my skull. "Leave." A sharp, unbearable pain shot through my head, like a drill boring into my skull. I stumbled backward, pressing my hands against my temples. The noise around me swelled, growing into a chaotic symphony of metallic screeches and garbled voices. Then I saw something worse. The figures working the machines. They weren't alive. Their bodies twitched unnaturally, their movements too rigid, too synchronized. Their arms moved like puppet strings were controlling them, jerking and snapping with every motion. And then, one by one, their heads snapped in my direction. A chorus of whispers filled the air. "You shouldn't be here. You were never supposed to see. Run!" My chest tightened as panic overtook me. I turned, searching desperately for an exit, but the factory layout had shifted. The doors were gone. The walls seemed closer, the aisles between the machines narrower. It was like the building itself was alive, rearranging itself to keep me trapped. Then the shadowy figure from before stepped forward, emerging from between two massive machines. But this time, it wasn't alone. A second figure appeared, then a third. More of them, tall and unnaturally thin, their limbs stretching too long, their faces hidden beneath deep black hoods. They stood motionless at first. Then, without warning, they rushed toward me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran, dodging between rusted pipes and conveyor belts that moved on their own, spewing out objects that didn't make sense. Broken dolls, rotten meat, human teeth. The floor beneath me groaned, cracking, as though something massive was underneath, waiting to break free. Then ahead of me, I saw it. A door. A single rusted metal door slightly ajar. It hadn't been there before. But I didn't care. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning. Just as I reached it, I felt cold fingers graze the back of my neck. A shiver shot through my spine, and I lunged forward, slamming my weight against the door. It burst open, and I fell into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then faintly, a voice echoed in the distance. "You finally see." I opened my eyes, and my stomach dropped. I wasn't in the factory anymore. I was in a room full of monitors, dozens of screens flickering with grainy security footage. Some showed the factory floor. Others showed the workers. But they weren't moving now. They were just standing there, staring at the cameras, their heads twitching in unison. Then I saw myself. One of the screens showed the security office, and there I was, sitting in the chair, completely still, my eyes staring blankly at the monitor. Number I turned, frantically looking for an exit. There was no door behind me. The walls were covered in cables, tangled and pulsing like veins. A faint humming filled the air, and as I stepped closer to the monitors, the screens glitched, flickering violently. And then, a face appeared on every screen, a face with black, empty sockets for eyes. A voice, distorted and mechanical, whispered from all around me. "You were never supposed to leave." The whisper echoed through the room, crawling into my skull like a swarm of insects. My breathing was erratic, my chest rising and falling in frantic gasps as I stared at the screens. I was still sitting there, my body, or something that looked like me, frozen in that security chair. The figure with empty sockets was standing right behind me on the monitor, its fingers almost grazing my shoulder. But in this room, wherever I was, there was nothing behind me. I spun around, expecting to see it, but all I found was darkness. The monitors flickered violently, static hissing in the air, and then, suddenly, the screen showed a countdown. 0 to 10, 0 to 9. I had no idea what was about to happen, but every nerve in my body screamed run. I turned, desperately searching for a way out. The walls were shifting, cables writhing like living tendrils, pulsing with an unnatural glow. My own reflection glitched on the screens, my face distorting, stretching unnaturally, my mouth opening wider and wider until 0005. The factory groaned, the metal walls trembling like they were about to collapse. A deep, mechanical roar filled the space, vibrating through my bones. The screens flickered, and suddenly, the workers moved. Their heads snapped up in unison, all of them looking directly at the cameras, directly at me. Their mouths opened in silent screams, and the factory itself shook violently. 003. I stumbled forward, hands clawing at the walls, at the floor, trying to find something, anything that could get me out of this place. 0002. The monitors exploded in a burst of sparks and shattered glass. The air filled with an ear-splitting screech, like metal being torn apart from the inside. The cables that had been crawling along the walls lashed out, wrapping around my arms, my legs, dragging me toward the center of the room. And then, 0001. The room collapsed inward. Darkness swallowed me whole. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the cold, damp floor of the factory. The air was silent. No machines, no whispers, nothing. Just an eerie, suffocating stillness. I pushed myself up, my limbs aching, my head pounding. The factory looked the same, rusted walls, broken equipment. But something felt off. The security room door was gone. The monitors were gone. Had I imagined everything? I knew what I saw. I stumbled toward the exit, my mind racing, my hands still trembling. I needed to get out. I needed to leave this place and never come back. As I reached the massive factory doors, I hesitated. Something told me to look back one last time. I did, and I wished I hadn't. In the shadows of the factory floor behind the rows of dead machinery, they were standing there. The workers. Their hollow eyes were fixed on me, their bodies unnaturally still. But they weren't just watching. They were waiting. For what? I didn't know. I turned and ran. The factory door slammed shut behind me with a deafening clang. The night air hit me like a wave, cold and heavy. But I didn't stop running. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because even as I sprinted away, I could still hear the machines starting up again. And somewhere deep inside that factory, something was laughing.